All right. Wow. Two tough acts for me to follow. I thought Mary said it's like she has one tough act to follow. I got two tough acts to follow. And then when I hear Wen's speech, I was like, oh my gosh, I probably need to go a little impromptu here for my speech here. Probably it's like, because I was thinking about, it's like, how am I similar and how am I different from him? I mean, we both are in the health professions. He's a psychologist and I'm an occupational therapist. So it's like, it's very interesting to see the similarities and the differences we have. So for 25 years or so of my life, I remember I'll say as a normal kid, probably a very introverted kid, and probably my parents would have felt that way as well. So I'll go back to the very beginning of my life. When I was three and a half, that was about the time when I first learned how to speak. And I remember in Hong Kong, because that's where I grew up, and I learned Cantonese. At that time, my parents definitely was a little bit concerned because they're like, oh, come on, you gotta know how to speak. And in Hong Kong, unlike the US, we have 3 years of kindergarten. So definitely, I remember from my parents, they said, you know, when you were in kindergarten, we had to speak for you because you weren't able to speak yet. So I was like, what? I did not know that. And then, but then it's like I caught on good enough that actually I stayed in mainstream for all my life, pretty much. I never was in any specialized school, never had any accommodations whatsoever. I think the first sign of really struggling was I was in occupational therapy school. But back to my days in Hong Kong. So actually, for my academic subjects, I would say I'm at least average, if not above average. Until my college days, my strongest subject was actually mathematics. And I remember in 5th grade, before my family and I and my sister we immigrated to the US, actually I competed in the open qualifier for the International Math Olympiad. And definitely that was a very good experience itself at the time. And then in 1996, like many families in Hong Kong, we actually moved to the US. And the reason was because my family felt a lot of uncertainty about like when China is going to take over Hong Kong in 97. So that was the reason why my parents thought like, hey, you know, we got to move to the States because we want you and we want your sister to have a better chance at the future. And then when I got to the US in 1996, I spent 3 years in the English language development program. And that was a time where it's like I was trying to master English, and I was very fortunate that I got to place in a classroom where there's several classmates of mine who are Cantonese speaking. So we actually got to communicate in the same language. But of course, at that time, it was also very hard for my teachers because they're like, okay, we don't know your social struggles. Maybe is it because like you're pretty shy in terms of using English, you know? Because I heard from an instructional aide back then was like, if I started my US education in 6th grade, it'll take me 3 years to get to mainstream because of my English. So yeah, so that was a thing. And then they don't really watch my recess, so they don't. I was like, sometimes I'll sit quietly in the grassy area. Sometimes I'll try to play along with my classmates, playing handball, playing basketball. So yeah, I was like, I think I'll say those 3 years, it was a period where my teachers would not have a very good idea to gauge whether my play skills are very good or not, you know? And then in high school, I would say that's the time I probably had the most friends. And of course, occupational therapy school, that's a whole different animal. Yeah, but at that time in high school, definitely had the most friends. And I got into a lot of honors and advanced placement classes. Most of them were mathematics, no surprise at that time. Yeah, and then I graduated high school. I made it into a decent four-year university named University of California, Riverside. I would say among Asian parents, they probably perceived it as the bottom third among the quote-unquote UC schools, which is short for the University of California schools, for those of you who are out of the country or who are out of the locale. So yeah, but then, yeah, I would say those 4 years for me is like, it was probably the first time where we had to adjust to the unstructured time, so to speak, per se. Yeah. And I would say it's like definitely had some struggles making friends and also adjusting the routine of college. And because of that, I didn't network very well, which is very different compared to what my career is now. So not surprisingly, when I got on my undergrad, I was unemployed for a year. And I remember I interviewed for like about a dozen to a couple dozen jobs. And the common feedback I often heard from the interviewers often say, it's like, hey, you made some really good responses. It's just that your eye contact was very awful. At that time, I was aware of the eye contact issues that I had because my teachers sometimes would bring it on since I was like first grade, so I wasn't surprised by that. But then a year to my employment, my parents suggested like, hey, you can't be unemployed like this. You gotta do something. I was like, what can I do, So then I was like, okay. I tried to go business school at first because logically we had the least amount of courses to get into business school. But then when I took the entrance exam to go to the business school, I did not fare so well because while my mathematics was very strong, but my English was very weak. So my parents felt like, the prospect of getting a good school, not very good. And then we tried Seminary for once. And at that time, we knew a few preacher's kids who were doing seminary, or they just became a priest or a deacon. So they thought, like, hey, that's a good avenue for you to try. But then we look at the job prospects, it's like, no, it's not worth it because I don't really get a good return for my investment. And then how OT came about was really out of nowhere. Like my parents and I, we looked up like what the field was about. And at that time, like, my parents still don't know that I have autism at the time. So it was like, oh, good prospects, like pays well, low employment rate. So if I do a solid job in school, I should be able to make it. So then I went to the school that I came from at University of Southern California. I got to go to the orientation and listen to what the course was about. I came an hour late with my mom. So I actually missed the practical part of what occupational therapy is. I only hear about the research part, and at that time I was like, hey, you have a statistical mind, you should be able to do research in that field. You probably can make a niche in that area. But of course, my parents are dead wrong, and I think I was dead wrong too. And then, of course, now I would say it's like, now I'm at 33, so I say I started this journey 9 years ago. I couldn't believe that I'm here, to be honest with you. Yeah, so I think on paper, if people see my accomplishments, or they see like, hey, see me in the clinic, they're like, hey, this guy's nothing special. Like, why he doesn't pay his dues? Like, there should be more people who does more things in the profession to come up here. But I guess the reason why I'm here is because I'm both autistic and OT. So next point I'm going to share about is like, how did I find out my diagnosis at 25? So when I was in occupational therapy school, I definitely struggled. I mean, part of it was adjusting to the demands of the course, from statistics to occupational therapy. Definitely was a challenge for me. But then as I was trying to understand the content a little bit better, a new struggle emerged. And that was, I would say, that was my clinical or field work, which is almost like an internship, that kind of opportunity. And my clinical instructors, they exposed my other struggles that I did not realize that I had, which was reading social cues. At that time, I did not know what that meant. But I think over time, I read up some pediatric books on like how children with autism play, and then I thought, well, I really fit those boxes to a T. It's like, why didn't my parents let me know about this? And why didn't my school teachers know about this? So then I brought it up to my parents, and I was like, I'm very concerned, I may have autism. And at that time, they were like, no, you're in occupational therapy school of all places. You should have decent social skills. You should be able to be just fine, So I trust my mom's instinct at the time. And I would say that's one of the few times my mom was dead wrong. Yeah, so 6 months later, I did another clinical, and that was a more higher stakes clinical where I had to be hands-on and doing treatments, and definitely I struggled majorly. Aside from the struggles that my previous clinical instructors have mentioned, I also struggle in terms of doing documentations and planning out my treatments. So halfway into the internship, I actually walked away because I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore. I need to find some help. And that was the time when my parents were like, okay, you gotta find out what went wrong here. It's like, we spent a lot of money into this, you gotta find out why. Fortunately, I guess I had the school insurance at the time, so I was able to find out that I did have autism a month later. But the timing of which was very rough because it was only like 3 days before I began my second year of occupational therapy school. So at that time, I sort of expected diagnosis, but I was relieved that I finally put a name to my struggle, but at the same time, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm a differently able person now, you know? I gotta learn about myself all over again. And then on top of that, the load of grad school is definitely very overwhelming. So I remember I would say the first few weeks of school, I definitely was contemplating on my future because I realized like, hey, I failed clinical and I couldn't fail anymore. And then I was overwhelmed because not only had to do so much reading, I think it was like hundreds of pages of reading. Another that is like, I had to think about myself, what I'm all about in terms of autism, what kind of accommodations I might need in the future. I almost want to walk away and take a leave of absence at the time. But I guess my parents sort of pushed me through it, you know? So in 2011, I would say I was fortunate that academic portion at least, I was able to finish on time with my classmates. Even though I knew at the time I still had to catch up with my clinicals, I probably would be about a year behind. But I was like, you know what, I gotta do my best. And fast forward today, you know, it's like now I'm helping other autistic colleagues in their professional development. If you were to tell me that, I would say in 2010, 2011, I wouldn't have believed it. But I guess as my work has developed, I really believe that, hey, I believe I have a place in the profession. And in fact, a few weeks ago, I received an email from an OT student from Hong Kong who was autistic. And she has been asking me about advice in terms of how to proceed as an occupational therapy professional. So I was like, wow, I couldn't believe times have changed, you know? So some of the common stereotypes of autism, I think Gwen would have covered about this. So some maybe like sensory issues, social communication issues, transition struggles, like from transition from one thing to the next thing, or sometimes it's struggles to finger on the feet. And in the occupational therapy environment, finger on the feet is very critical because like you can't go to have a 5-step plan. I was like, okay, the client will do this, this, and this. It won't work that way. Sometimes it's like, oh, maybe that the patient is on dialysis, or like, hey, the patient doesn't feel well, or sometimes the meds are off, you know? Sometimes you gotta adjust, or sometimes it's like, what I think might work for the patient, but then I realize like, hey, it doesn't work. So I got to think on my feet. Over time, as people know about my story in the occupational therapy profession, I definitely got my share of social attention. And I will say from a typical conference that I go to, sometimes I have like 50 to like 250 people trying to talk to me in a span of 3 to 5 days. So that's a lot of social demands. But I would say it's like, definitely I've worked hard. And that's why I said my work ethic has definitely given me opportunities like this, you know, to speak to you guys in front of you guys today. And I would say I'm very fortunate to be a millennial because I got to use social media as sort of like my adaptive tools to get to know my colleagues a little bit better, or sometimes reach out to colleagues without being shy, because sometimes it's like, I know some autistic people, they prefer the text communication or like the instant messaging over the face-to-face communication. So social media has definitely helped me a lot. And for me, growing up in Hong Kong has definitely given me a very high sensory tolerance. Because like for the American Occupational Therapy Association conference, typically it could be like 7, 8, even like last year we had like 12,000 people. And that could be like sensory hell for a lot of autistic individuals. And I know a couple of autistic colleagues as well, and they've been telling me about how last year's conference went. And I was like, dude, that's sensory hell. I don't know how you made it. So another one is like, as I mentioned, is like high social demands, and then also like occasional issues to build a rapport with peers that still exist. What I mean by that is sometimes I go to a place of work, and sometimes I meet somebody who's new in the we have a department because I work in the aged care or in nursing home facilities. And sometimes it's like, hey, I got to work with that person. So sometimes if I work with somebody new, sometimes it's like getting to know the mannerism, getting to know their personality. Sometimes that's very difficult when it's on the spot like this. And then for me, it's like, because I work in a nursing home that doesn't have very many clients, so actually I had to travel to other nursing homes that my company also has contract with to get my working hours. So therefore, my workplaces they change a lot. And then sometimes the changes, they would happen with like little to no notice. So sometimes I'll get a text in the morning and say, hey, you got to go to this place. Versus like, oh, maybe like sometimes they change their mind so much. It's like, hey, maybe like a couple of hours later, it's like, hey, you got to go to this place as well for overtime. So, whoa, that's very overwhelming, isn't it? But that's how I do sometimes, to afford to go to something like this. Oops. So next on the list is like being in Hong Kong, my parents actually emphasized that I must transition well. Like I had to go with the flow. Like common thing in my parents' car, they always say is like, hey, let's go out to eat. But sometimes they'll say, oh, let's go to a Subway or something like that. And then in the middle of the night, they're like, oh, no, let's go to dim sum instead. So they're like, the expectation is like, hey, I can't throw a tantrum because like, hey, they got to go with the flow. And then next on the list is, like many Asian families, my family has very high expectations on me. So doing something like this definitely is making them proud. And then also, like I learned from my past mistakes. I would say from the social front or even from the professional front, I try to reflect upon what went wrong, and then hopefully I don't make the same mistakes again. And then being a student in the game, I actually copied it from a sports saying, because sometimes I realize that, hey, I know that I still have a long way to go for my career. I know that it's like there's still a lot of opportunities in front of me as my career. So I want to figure out like, hey, what should I do for my next step, so to speak? Some of the services I receive is clinical psychology. They're more likely for my medication management because they were the one who prescribed the anti-anxiety medications I had while I was doing my clinicals. And then I received some counseling from my school. It was basically some group-based social skills training and occupational therapy. I was very fortunate that University of Southern California, they had a lifestyle design program, or AKA occupational therapy faculty practice. So I got to learn some coping skills, got to learn some job readiness skills, got to learn some community integration skills, et cetera. And I would say probably in that place, I probably was the longest tenured client because I was in there for like 3.5 years. So what I really want to know is I really earned the opportunities I've given. And when people look at my resume, it's like, hey, how come you did this? But behind the scenes, I really worked hard. And then I really worked hard to overcome some of the obstacles to prevent me to reach my maximum potential. Like standing in front of you guys today, I know before occupational therapy school, my public speaking skills really sucks. So for me to overcome that and speaking to you guys today definitely is one of the obstacles I've overcome. And then my current social skills, I would say, is definitely set some small and achievable goals for myself so that I can build some more social competence. I know I'm not perfect. I mean, like, sometimes my eye contact is a little bit off. I'm moving all over the place. And then I've also learned to embrace my limitations and weaknesses. And I think that is very important because I know I'm a very go-getter, so to speak. But at the same time I realize, like, hey, you know what? I have some limitations. There are some things that I definitely cannot do because maybe I'm not good at this ever, even if I try my best. So it's like, you know what? Sometimes I gotta learn how to be content with what I have. And another thing I learned is I advocate for autism differently because I remember my teachers once said, it's like, hey, you put your paper to sign your name on a document. It means like you gotta be accountable for what you said. So I had to be very careful on social media. And then I perceive myself as a health professional first and an autism self-advocate second. Because at the end of the day, being in occupational therapy is my day job. And then income is very crucial. I learned because I met an autism self-advocate and she went to the guest the American Occupational Therapy Conference as on the guest pass, and that was a struggle for her. Versus me as a privileged physician, for sure. So therefore, it's like, hey, you know what? Income for sub-advocates to do their thing is very critical. Anyways, that's my presentation. Thank you.